Tonight, we uncover a secret buried beneath the walls of Rome, a truth so unsettling that the Vatican has kept it hidden for millennia. They did not simply lock it away, they controlled it, catalogued it, and whispered its existence only to a select few. The Annunaki, sky beings, gods of Mesopotamia whose knowledge shaped the earliest civilizations, are not just myths. Somewhere deep within the archives, their story is preserved, filtered through translations, hidden in manuscripts, and encoded in symbols that adorn the church itself. Those who glimpse the evidence face silenced whispers, vanished careers, and records that disappear without explanation. And those who attempt to speak, their voices are swallowed by centuries of secrecy. So before we descend into the vaults, before we trace the path from Sumer to St. Peter's Square, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because the questions we are about to ask may never have been asked before, and the answers may change everything you thought you knew about history. Beneath the marble streets of Rome, under the echo of centuries of prayer, there are whispers of something far older than the church itself. Something the Vatican has guarded, not out of devotion, but out of fear. Imagine a vault so deep that its air has never touched sunlight, and within it, locked behind iron gates, lie fragments of clay inscribed with symbols from a world that existed long before the first Christian cross was ever carved. These are not the writings of saints or apostles. They are the language of gods, the Annunaki, the ancient beings who, according to Sumerian texts, came down from the heavens and shaped humanity. When most people think of the Vatican, they think of faith, of popes, of gold ceilings and solemn hymns. Few imagine that buried beneath all that holiness might be the memory of something not divine, but extraterrestrial. Yet, what if the Vatican's greatest secret is not what it teaches, but what it remembers? History tells us that the Church became the guardian of knowledge after the fall of Rome. It preserved what others burned. It decided what humanity was allowed to read, to learn, to believe. But what happens when the knowledge being guarded does not speak of heaven, but of beings who came from the stars? The story of the Anunnaki begins thousands of years before Christ, in ancient Sumer, the cradle of civilization. There, people spoke of gods who descended from the sky, who gave mankind writing, laws, and architecture. They called them the Annunaki, the those who came from above. They were said to have walked among humans, taught them, ruled them, and then vanished. For centuries, this was dismissed as myth. But myths often hide truths too dangerous for power to handle. Archaeologists have long searched for clues among the ruins of Ur, Nippur, and Babylon. Cuneiform tablets describe machines that flew, weapons that could turn mountains to dust, and kings who ruled for thousands of years. These tablets were unearthed, catalogued, and then quietly disappeared. Some ended up in museums, others were reportedly purchased by private collectors, and a few, curiously, were acquired by Catholic missionaries and never seen again. The Church calls it preservation. Historians call it coincidence, but what if it is neither? The Vatican's archives stretch over 50 miles of shelving. Among its countless manuscripts are letters, maps, and records gathered from every empire that ever existed. Inside are documents never released to the public, sealed by papal order for reasons only known to a handful of men. What if among them lie the missing pieces of humanity's earliest story? A story where the gods of Sumer and the angels of heaven are one and the same? Could it be that the Vatican knows humanity was once touched by something far beyond this world? That the creators worshipped by ancient Sumerians are not myths but memories. Memories preserved in clay, now guarded beneath the stones of Rome. Tonight, as the bells of St. Peter's toll across the city, remember this: the greatest secret may not be hidden in heaven, but in the vault below. And perhaps within those walls, the Vatican still keeps the oldest question of all: who made us? Long before the stories of Adam and Eve or the tablets of Moses, there were other gods who walked among men. Their names were whispered across the deserts of Mesopotamia, carved into stone thousands of years before the first Bible verse was ever written. They were called the Annunaki, the sky beings, the ones who came from above. To the people of Sumer, these beings were not invisible spirits or distant deities. They were physical, powerful, and astonishingly human in form. They descended from the heavens, not as light or smoke, but in machines that roared like thunder. They brought order where chaos ruled. They taught mankind how to build cities, measure the stars, and speak in symbols carved into wet clay. They were the first lawgivers, the first scientists, and perhaps the first rulers this world ever knew. In ancient Sumerian art, they are never shown as phantoms. They are tall, broad-shouldered figures with wings that resemble engineered flight rather than feathers of faith. Around them are tools that look less like divine scepters and more like devices of precision, rods and wheels, strange shapes that modern eyes cannot easily explain. Above their heads are stars, suns, and what some archaeologists once mistook for constellations, yet their placement suggests something else. Something mechanical, as if the Sumerians were recording not worship but memory. In temple inscriptions, the Anunnaki are described as descending from the sky on beams of fire. They chose leaders, taught agriculture, and handed down systems of law to the people of that time. These gifts were miracles. To us, they look suspiciously like technology. Could the Anunnaki have been visitors from another world, guiding humanity's first steps? The earliest Sumerian records speak of a god named Enki, the bringer of knowledge, and his counterpart Enlil, the lord of command. They were said to have shaped mankind from the dust of the earth, mixed with the essence of the gods. A tale that would echo centuries later in Genesis. When the gods grew weary of human noise, a flood was sent to cleanse the world. One man was warned, built a vessel, and survived. His name was not Noah, but Zeushudra. The story is nearly identical, only older. These are not coincidences. They are echoes of a forgotten truth retold under new names. Modern archaeologists dismiss these stories as myth, claiming that ancient people invented gods to explain what they could not understand. But how does a civilization that predates the wheel describe planets, orbits, and the movement of stars with such mathematical precision? How did they know that Earth was a sphere floating in space when their world ended at the horizon? The Sumerians claimed they were taught by those who came from the sky, the Anunnaki. Perhaps the real question is not whether they existed, but why their memory had to be buried beneath new gods. If the Vatican truly knows who the Anunnaki were, it is because these ancient sky beings were not gods of myth, they were teachers. And the Church, for centuries, has held the remnants of their lessons hidden in plain sight. When Christianity first rose from the shadows of the Roman Empire, the world was already crowded with gods. Every city, every valley, every river had its own divine ruler. From the shining temples of Egypt to the marble altars of Greece, humanity had long worshipped beings who walked, ruled, and sometimes punished from the heavens above. The new faith did not appear in an empty world. It appeared in a world overflowing with gods who looked far too similar to the ones the Church would later call angels. In the early centuries after Christ, Christian leaders faced a challenge that was not just spiritual but political. How do you make people abandon their old gods when their memories are built upon them? The answer was not to erase but to transform. Temples became churches, goddesses became saints, sacred groves were renamed holy sites. the church absorbed what it could not destroy. The mother goddess of the old world, Isis in Egypt, or Inanna in Sumer, slowly turned into the image of the Virgin Mary, draped in blue, holding a divine child beneath a halo of stars. The old gods were not forgotten. They were reborn, repainted, and renamed under the symbol of the cross. But there were some gods the church could not easily absorb, the Annunaki, the ancient sky beings who came before all others. Their stories spoke of power not granted from heaven but descending from the sky. Their symbols were not crosses or serpents but stars and wings, tools and fire. To claim them as angels would mean admitting that heaven might be far more literal than spiritual. To destroy them entirely would risk losing the oldest knowledge ever recorded by human hands. So the church did something else. It studied them in silence. As Christianity spread, priests and scholars encountered myths from older civilizations that mirrored biblical creation stories too closely to ignore. The flood of Zeus-Shudra, the clay-born humans moulded by Enki, the heavenly law tablets that predated Moses. These parallels disturbed theologians because they hinted at a past where the church was not the first to speak of God, but merely the latest to rename him. In the dark rooms of monasteries, monks translated Sumerian and Babylonian records, quietly noting their resemblance to Genesis. Yet their findings never reached the pulpits. They were archived, sealed, and labelled heretical. The church that inherited the world also inherited its forgotten gods. Over time, the Annunaki were written out of existence, their names reduced to whispers of fallen angels or pagan demons. But beneath the marble of St. Peter's, their memory may still linger, not as myth, but as evidence that humanity once stood face to face with its makers. And perhaps the Vatican knows that in order to hold power over faith, it had to bury the gods that came before it, even if those gods were the true architects of our beginning. In the 19th century, the deserts of Mesopotamia became the stage for one of the greatest archaeological races in history. Beneath the sands of what is now Iraq and Syria lay the broken remains of the world's first civilization, and within those ruins rested clay tablets older than any Bible, older even than the pyramids of Egypt. They were the words of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians, etched in cuneiform script by hands that lived thousands of years before Christ. Explorers, scholars, and treasure hunters from Europe rushed to claim them, each seeking proof of the origins of civilization. But quietly moving among them were others whose mission was not discovery but collection. Men wearing simple robes and crosses, missionaries, priests, agents, tied to the church. To the public, they were men of faith spreading the word of God. Yet their letters tell another story. Many were sent not just to preach, but to recover, to find artifacts that might challenge or confirm the sacred narrative. Reports from the mid-1800s describe shipments of tablets sent to Rome under church supervision. These were not the famous tablets that ended up in the British Museum or the Louvre. These were the ones that disappeared. Archaeologists who once catalogued entire crates of Sumerian relics later found them missing from records. Their trail often ended in the hands of religious orders or private collectors connected to the Vatican. Officially, these relics were said to have been preserved for translation or protected from desecration. But why would the church, which had no museum for Mesopotamian relics, be so intent on preserving them? The answer may lie in what those tablets contained. Many spoke of gods descending from the sky, of men created in their image, of rulers chosen by divine visitors. To a church that taught that creation began with Adam and Eve, such stories were dangerous. If the Anunnaki were real, if they were beings of knowledge and power who came from above, then Genesis was no longer the beginning but a retelling. In the early 20th century, as linguists began to decode cuneiform with new precision, a quiet shift occurred. Certain translations, particularly those referencing celestial beings and flying machines, were dismissed as mistranslations and removed from public view. Meanwhile, Catholic scholars published heavily edited summaries that emphasized morality and myth rather than literal events. It was not destruction that erased these records, but silence. A silence enforced by ownership. By the time the modern age arrived, the Vatican's archives already contained thousands of ancient manuscripts from around the world. Some historians now believe that among those dusty shelves lie fragments of the lost Sumerian texts, the ones that tell of the Annunaki, hidden from public study. If true, it means that while museums display fragments of the ancient world, the most revealing pieces rest beneath the floor of the Vatican, where light and truth are filtered through centuries of careful hands. What they hold is not just clay, it is memory itself, shaped before history began. Every word we know about the ancient world passes through the hands of translators. When the first cuneiform tablets were uncovered in the mid-1800s, their symbols were meaningless scratches until a few scholars learned to read them. These early translators became the gatekeepers of the past, the small circle through which all knowledge of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon would flow. With every translation came choices. A single Sumerian word could mean sky, or heaven, or space, depending on how it was read. Another could mean God, or master, or simply one who descends. And in those choices, history could be reshaped. A line that once described beings who came from the stars could, with one careful edit, become a metaphor for divine inspiration. A record of an encounter could be rewritten as a prayer. Over time, the story of the Anunnaki changed, not because the tablets were false, but because their meaning was adjusted, softened, and polished until it fit within the acceptable bounds of theology. The Church was never blind to this. From the early 19th century, many of the linguists working in the field of Assyriology came from religious universities or institutions quietly supported by the Vatican. To the world, they were scholars of language. To the Church, they were filters ensuring that ancient stories would not ignite dangerous questions. The translation of sacred or pre-biblical texts was treated as a delicate matter, one requiring spiritual supervision. Words that might suggest the Anunnaki were real beings, perhaps visitors from another world, were replaced with poetic terms. Descriptions of sky chariots became clouds of glory. Beams of light became visions, and thus the truth was edited into myth. This was not censorship by force, but by elegance, a gentle rewriting that left no fingerprints. Even in modern times, very few people can read ancient Sumerian fluently. Most of what the public knows about these texts comes from English or Latin translations that trace back to the work of a handful of translators. Their interpretations, often shaped by theological bias, are treated as fact. The original words remain locked in museums and archives, accessible only to a chosen few. The Vatican's interest in this is subtle but powerful. As the keeper of one of the largest collections of ancient manuscripts on earth, the Church has long understood the danger of language. If a phrase from an ancient tablet could challenge the divine story of creation, it must be interpreted carefully. If an inscription could link the gods of Sumer to the angels of the Bible, it must be explained as allegory, not evidence. Translation is not just about words. It is about control. Through translation, history becomes what the translator allows it to be. And so the Anunnaki, once remembered as beings who walked the earth and ruled the skies, became distant myths, stripped of their substance, polished into poetry. The truth was never destroyed. It was simply rewritten in a language no one was allowed to truly understand. Long before the book of Genesis was written, the people of Sumer told stories about gods who created mankind from clay, breathed life into him, and placed him in a garden between two great rivers. They called it the Garden of the Gods, a place where humans lived in peace until they disobeyed their creators and were cast out into the wild world. Thousands of years later, that story would appear again, this time in Hebrew form as the Garden of Eden. But how could two civilizations, separated by centuries, tell the same story with the same details? Either coincidence is stranger than truth, or the story of Eden was not new at all. In the Sumerian tablets, the beings who shaped humanity were the Annunaki, powerful figures who descended from the sky to organize the earth. They molded mankind to work the land, to mine, to serve. Their leader, Enki, was said to have mixed clay with the essence of the gods to create the first humans. In Genesis, God forms man from dust and breathes life into him. The pattern is exact, only the names have changed. When humanity grew restless, both the Sumerian and biblical texts describe a flood sent by heaven. In one version, the gods decide to wipe out mankind for its noise and rebellion. In the other, the Creator destroys his creation for its sin. Both tell of a single chosen man warned in advance. In the Sumerian tale, his name is Ziusudra. In the Akkadian version, Utnapishtim. In the Hebrew, Noah. Each builds a great vessel, fills it with animals, survives the deluge, and is granted favour by the gods. The oldest flood story ever discovered was written more than 2,000 years before Genesis. Even the measurement of the ark's size appears similar. Were these ancient people sharing mythic poetry or recording an event witnessed by all humanity and retold through generations? The Anunnaki are also said to have chosen bloodlines. They mixed their essence with that of humans, producing rulers known as the kings of divine descent. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim, the sons of God who came down to earth and took human wives. Both traditions describe a merging between heaven and earth, between divine beings and mortal flesh. The parallels do not end there. The tablets speak of heavenly laws handed down from the gods, of towers built to reach the sky, of punishment for human pride, of a paradise lost. These are not fragments from one culture copied by another. They are part of a continuous thread that winds through time, connecting Sumer to the scriptures. So what does that mean? It means the stories we know as divine revelation may in fact be memories of contact, rewritten to fit a new age of faith. The Vatican knows this. They have studied the parallels and understand that Genesis may not be an original creation, but a carefully cleaned reflection of something far older, a message from the sky that humanity was never meant to forget, yet never allowed to fully understand. From the very beginning, power on earth has always traced its roots back to the heavens. In the oldest Sumerian records, kings were not chosen by men but appointed by the gods. The texts describe a time when kingship descended from the sky, when the Anunnaki selected specific bloodlines to rule over humanity in their stead. These rulers were seen as bridges between the divine and the mortal, carrying within them the essence of their creators. To defy a king was to defy the gods who had placed him there. This idea did not fade with time. It evolved, reshaped, and survived. When we read the Bible, the pattern repeats. The genealogies of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and David are listed with obsessive detail. Every name, every generation, carefully preserved. as if to remind future rulers that their authority came not from the people but from a sacred line stretching back to the beginning of time. The question is, why? Why would ancient texts across different cultures care so deeply about bloodlines unless those bloodlines carried something more than symbolism? The Sumerians believed their kings possessed a trace of divine essence, passed down from their creators, the Annunaki. They ruled not by merit but by inheritance. The same principle echoes in the idea of the divine right of kings that shaped Europe for centuries. Monarchs claimed they ruled by God's will, not by human choice. But if the origin of that right was not heaven but something older, something not entirely human, then the world's royal families might be managing an inheritance far more mysterious than Scripture admits. The Church has long been the guardian of genealogies, keeping records of births, coronations, and dynasties. Within the Vatican archives lie detailed family histories of monarchs stretching back to times when kings were seen as divine intermediaries. Yet buried within those records are strange references, fragments that scholars rarely discuss. Mentions of blood blessed by the stars, of seed carried from the heavens. Phrases that sound poetic until one remembers the Sumerian tales of the Annunaki, mixing their essence with humankind. If these ancient beings did create or alter humanity, and if certain lineages preserved traces of that origin, then the entire framework of authority shifts. Modern religion and monarchy would no longer stand as spiritual symbols, but as living legacies of contact. Perhaps this is why the Church has spent centuries controlling genealogical records, crowning kings, and approving heirs. To admit that royal blood might be more than metaphor would be to confess that power itself was inherited from those who once ruled from the sky. It would mean the throne and the altar are both remnants of an ancient arrangement between gods and men. The Vatican may know this truth, hidden in the coded language of old manuscripts and secret archives. The right to rule, once divine, may have been celestial all along, and the echoes of that forgotten pact still shape our world today. In the earliest days of Christianity, before the Bible was shaped into a single book, the faith was a swirling sea of ideas, visions, and forgotten texts. Among those writings were descriptions of beings that did not look like the gentle angels of stained glass windows. They were vast, shining entities with eyes like burning stars, wheels within wheels, voices that shook mountains, and faces hidden behind fire. These were called the Watchers, the Thrones, the Powers, and the Seraphim. They descended from the heavens, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and were later cast down for their defiance. To the early church, these stories were a problem. They sounded too much like the ancient tales of the Anunnaki. In the Book of Enoch, a text once read alongside the scriptures but later banned, the Watchers come from the sky and mingle with humans, giving them wisdom in metalwork, astronomy, and healing. For this they are condemned, yet their gifts change the course of civilization. The pattern mirrors the Sumerian account of the Anunnaki descending to teach humanity the arts of life. The resemblance was so clear that the early theologians could not ignore it. They faced a choice. Either acknowledge that the so-called angels might be the same beings once worshipped as gods, or rewrite the story so that these visitors became symbols of spiritual truth, not flesh and blood reality. The decision was made in silence. By the time the Church consolidated its doctrine in the 4th century, the Watchers and other strange beings were declared heretical or reinterpreted as metaphors. The Book of Enoch was erased from the official canon. Those who questioned the nature of angels were silenced or branded as mystics. From that moment on, the heavenly hosts were given wings, robes, and halos. Their alien grandeur softened into human shapes that fit inside cathedrals. But in the hidden corners of early Christian thought, fragments of the original vision remained. The Gnostics spoke of archons, powerful entities who shaped the material world. The Hermetic texts described celestial beings who governed creation from the stars. Even some church fathers wrote uneasily about angels who came down to dwell among men. These were not figures of faith, they were memories of contact. The Vatican inherited this confusion and never truly resolved it. Within its archives lie the apocryphal writings that speak too directly of beings who walked with men, who shone like fire, who spoke of the heavens as if they had come from them. Over centuries, the Church turned them into symbols, their history reduced to allegory, yet the old words still whisper the same truth. The angels of the Bible and the gods of Sumer may have been the same visitors seen through different eyes. Early theologians knew it, they chose to bury it. And ever since, humanity has worshipped what it was once taught to fear, never realizing the stars above might hold the faces of the very beings our ancestors once called the Annunaki. In the centuries after Christ, the story of heaven and earth was rewritten not by prophets, but by men seated in council chambers. Between the 2nd and 5th centuries, bishops and theologians gathered in grand halls to decide which texts would define the Christian world and which would be cast into darkness. These meetings were not simple debates about belief. They were acts of filtration. The universe as humanity once knew it, vast and filled with many beings from the stars, was reduced to a single narrative that could fit safely within the walls of doctrine. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325, the Council of Laodicea in 363, the Council of Carthage, the Council of Chalcedon, each step drew the circle of faith tighter. Hundreds of writings were reviewed, questioned, and judged. Some were declared divine truth, others were labelled heresy and destroyed. Among those excluded were texts that spoke of a multi-layered heaven, of divine councils of gods, of angels who governed planets, and of humans created through intervention rather than spontaneous divine will. The ancient world had believed in a cosmos, alive with watchers and builders. The councils silenced it. The Book of Enoch vanished. The Gospel of Thomas, which hinted that divinity could be found within man himself, was buried. The Gnostic texts that described creation as the work of powerful celestial beings were condemned. Anything that hinted that humans were shaped by more than one God, by more than one intelligence, was cut away. What remained was a simple story, easy to preach, easy to control. One God above, one creation below, one book to explain it all. The Vatican would later inherit the results of those decisions. Within its walls, the rejected writings were not burned entirely. Many were copied and locked away. To destroy them would erase too much. To reveal them would unravel the foundation. So they became private, secret, labelled Apocrypha. Hidden cosmologies of a universe that once included visitors, engineers, and teachers from the sky. Even the language of Scripture was reshaped. The Hebrew word Elohim, a plural noun meaning gods, was retranslated as a singular God. Passages that once described divine councils were rephrased into metaphor. Stories of fiery chariots became visions. The acts of creation that hinted at craftsmanship were rewritten as miracles. The redaction was elegant, thorough, and deliberate. By the time the Bible was finalized, humanity had been cut off from its cosmic heritage. The church that emerged was not built to explore the stars, but to control the story of heaven. The councils did not only define faith, they defined what humanity would be allowed to remember about its origins. And if, within those lost texts, lay the memory of the Annunaki, of beings who walked among the first people and gave them knowledge, then the councils succeeded. They did not destroy the evidence. They simply rewrote the universe until no one could see where the stars had once touched the earth. Deep beneath the sunlit courtyards of Vatican City lies a silence thicker than stone. It is not the silence of prayer or reflection. It is the silence of things never meant to be heard. Miles of corridors stretch under the earth, lined with shelves that disappear into shadow. The Vatican Secret Archive, known officially as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, is a labyrinth of memory. No map is complete. No visitor sees more than a fraction. Even the popes themselves are said to know only part of what rests there. I imagine walking through its halls, past doors marked in Latin, each one labelled private, each one guarding a world. The air is dry, filtered, the scent of parchment and dust heavy like incense. Behind locked cabinets are the records of centuries, but among the papal decrees and imperial letters, other things are said to sleep. Untranslated cuneiform rubbings brought back from 19th century excavations in Mesopotamia, sent to Rome by missionaries, who believed they had found proof that the gods of the Bible were not alone. Reports from Jesuit astronomers stationed in far corners of the world describing strange lights moving against the constellations. Letters from priests in the Amazon and Africa who wrote of tribes that still worshipped sky gods and remembered visitors who descended in fire. The Church called these documents curiosities, catalogued them under anthropology or theology, and then quietly sealed them. Nothing is destroyed. Everything is preserved. But preservation is not revelation. In one sealed room, they say, lie wax-sealed tablets with inscriptions too fragile to expose. Another chamber holds manuscripts written in unknown scripts, some said to predate even Hebrew. Scholars who have glimpsed them speak of diagrams, of figures that look less like angels and more like men in flight. A collection marked only as Astronomia contains observations made by Jesuit scholars between the 16th and 18th centuries. Within it are sketches of objects seen crossing the moon, lights over Rome, and notations about alignments that do not match modern astronomy. None of it has been released to the public. Officially, the archive exists to protect the privacy of the papacy, but among its millions of pages are histories that no one has read in full. Histories that suggest humanity's story may not belong only to Earth. The archive is a monument not to faith, but to control. Everything known, everything questioned, filed away in perfect order. If one were to open those shelves, to trace the hidden paths of the missionaries, linguists, and astronomers who filled them, a pattern might emerge. A record of contact stretching from the deserts of Sumer to the jungles of the New World, all speaking of the same beings. The Vatican calls it private. Others might call it evidence. Down here, in the cold glow of forgotten lamps, the line between religion and revelation blurs. Somewhere in these endless halls, the story of the Annunaki may still rest, waiting for the one reader who is finally allowed to see it. Of all the orders within the Catholic Church, none have been as mysterious or as brilliant as the Jesuits. Founded in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola, they were trained to be the thinkers and explorers of faith, the Church's intellectual strike force. They sailed across oceans, mapped continents, studied the heavens, and became the guardians of the Church's scientific reputation. To many, they were priests. To those who understood their true role, they were the eyes and ears of the Vatican, watching not only the world, but the stars. From the very beginning, the Jesuits had a strange relationship with the sky. They built some of the earliest observatories in Europe. They charted eclipses, comets, and new planets with precision that rivaled royal astronomers. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar in 1582, it was Jesuit mathematicians who calculated the change. They knew how to bend time itself into alignment with the heavens. But why was a religious order so obsessed with astronomy? The official answer is that they sought to perfect the Church's understanding of creation, yet scattered through their letters and private notes are hints of something deeper. The Jesuits did not only map stars. They searched for patterns, alignments, and cycles that repeated across centuries. They compared ancient Babylonian and Sumerian star charts with their own observations and found anomalies, constellations drawn slightly out of place, as if the sky itself had shifted since those maps were made. To them, the difference was not random. It was evidence that someone had once drawn those maps from a different vantage point, perhaps from beyond Earth. Some Jesuit astronomers even noted that certain myths from Sumer described gods who travelled between the stars. They called them the Annunaki. Quietly, they wondered if these stories were symbolic or historical. Their reports, written in Latin, were sent not to public universities, but directly to the Vatican. Nothing was ever published. The order's discoveries went upward, not outward. Over time, the Jesuits became the keepers of celestial secrets. They operated observatories in Rome, Argentina, and even on Mount Graham in Arizona, where the Vatican still maintains one of the most advanced telescopes in the world. Officially, it studies galaxies. Unofficially, it continues a legacy that began centuries ago when Jesuit priests first turned their eyes to the sky, searching not only for God, but for the traces of those who might have come before him. The Vatican never opposed science, it managed it. By controlling the flow of astronomical knowledge, the Church could decide what humanity was ready to know about its place in the universe. Perhaps the Jesuits found more than they were allowed to share. Patterns that hinted at prior visitations. Records of comets that arrived too regularly. Alignments that pointed to constellations sacred to the Annunaki. The Jesuits mapped the heavens, but the heavens mapped something back. And those maps, still hidden within Vatican vaults, may hold the proof that the watchers from the stars never truly left. They only changed who told their story. Walk through the great cathedrals of Europe and look closely. Beyond the candles and stained glass, beyond the saints frozen in devotion, another story hides in plain sight. The walls are alive with beings of impossible form, angels cast in bronze, carved in marble, painted on ceilings that seem to open into the sky. They are called messengers of God. Yet their shapes and tools hint at something far older and stranger. Some wear helmets that look more like visors than halos. Others hold circular instruments, gears, or rods that resemble devices rather than symbols. Many are surrounded by rings of fire or appear inside wheels within wheels, forms too mechanical for a world that had not yet discovered machines. To most, these are artistic flourishes, metaphors of divine light. But what if they are not inventions of faith? What if they are memories rendered in stone, echoes of beings once seen by human eyes, beings the ancients called the Annunaki? Artists of the early church did not work in isolation. Many were trained in workshops that inherited the visual traditions of Babylon, Egypt, and Greece. They copied from ancient models without always understanding their meaning. When they sculpted winged figures descending from the heavens, they were not creating new images, but preserving old ones under a new name. The wings may have been symbols of flight, the halos symbols of radiant power, the rods symbols of technology beyond comprehension. As the church grew in influence, these motifs were softened into acceptable theology. The gods of the past became angels, their tools transformed into emblems of faith, yet the details never disappeared. In the Vatican's own collection, in rooms rarely shown to the public, there are reliefs and statues depicting beings with large eyes, layered armour, and objects resembling control panels or helmets. Historians call them allegories, but for those who know the stories of the Annunaki, they look like portraits of a forgotten encounter. Even the cherubim guarding the Ark of the Covenant in biblical descriptions resemble ancient Sumerian guardians, part human, part bird, part machine. The same form repeats in medieval frescoes, in the luminous visions of Ezekiel, in the swirling patterns of Renaissance domes. Every generation retold what it saw through the language it understood. To the ancients, these visitors were gods. To the prophets, they were angels. To the artists, they were visions. But the form never changed. Perhaps these artworks are not proof, but memory, the collective attempt of humanity to preserve what could not be spoken. The Church never denied these images. It simply redefined them. It allowed the sculptures and paintings to remain, but buried their origins beneath layers of doctrine. When we walk through the Vatican museums, we are surrounded by these silent witnesses, cast in gold and marble, smiling gently as if amused by what they have become. Angels, yes, but perhaps also the last trace of the ones who came from the stars, remembered not by their names, but by the light that once shone from their eyes. Walk through the great cathedrals of Europe and look closely. Beyond the candles and stained glass, beyond the saints frozen in devotion, another story hides in plain sight. The walls are alive with beings of impossible form. Angels cast in bronze, carved in marble, painted on ceilings that seem to open into the sky. They are called messengers of God, yet their shapes and tools hint at something far older and stranger. Some wear helmets that look more like visors than halos. Others hold circular instruments, gears or rods that resemble devices rather than symbols. Many are surrounded by rings of fire or appear inside wheels within wheels, forms too mechanical for a world that had not yet discovered machines. To most, these are artistic flourishes, metaphors of divine light. But what if they are not inventions of faith? What if they are memories rendered in stone, echoes of beings once seen by human eyes, beings the ancients called the Annunaki? Artists of the early church did not work in isolation. Many were trained in workshops that inherited the visual traditions of Babylon, Egypt, and Greece. They copied from ancient models without always understanding their meaning. When they sculpted winged figures descending from the heavens, they were not creating new images, but preserving old ones under a new name. The wings may have been symbols of flight, the halos symbols of radiant power, the rods symbols of technology beyond comprehension. As the church grew in influence, these motifs were softened into acceptable theology. The gods of the past became angels, their tools transformed into emblems of faith, yet the details never disappeared. In the Vatican's own collection, in rooms rarely shown to the public, there are reliefs and statues depicting beings with large eyes, layered armor, and objects resembling control panels or helmets. Historians call them allegories, but for those who know the stories of the Annunaki, they look like portraits of a forgotten encounter. Even the cherubim guarding the Ark of the Covenant in biblical descriptions resemble ancient Sumerian guardians, part human, part bird, part machine. The same form repeats in medieval frescoes, in the luminous visions of Ezekiel, in the swirling patterns of Renaissance domes. Every generation retold what it saw through the language it understood. To the ancients, these visitors were gods. To the prophets, they were angels. To the artists, they were visions. But the form never changed. Perhaps these artworks are not proof, but memory, the collective attempt of humanity to preserve what could not be spoken. The Church never denied these images, it simply redefined them. It allowed the sculptures and paintings to remain, but buried their origins beneath layers of doctrine. When we walk through the Vatican museums, we are surrounded by these silent witnesses, cast in gold and marble, smiling gently as if amused by what they have become. Angels, yes, but perhaps also the last trace of the ones who came from the stars, remembered not by their names, but by the light that once shone from their eyes. Every ancient discovery begins the same way, a shovel striking stone, a whisper of history rising from the dust. Archaeologists and missionaries alike once wandered the deserts of Mesopotamia, digging where empires had crumbled, uncovering clay tablets etched with lines that had not been read for thousands of years. They sent their findings to museums, universities, and sometimes directly to the Vatican. At first, every discovery was celebrated, but as the translations began to take shape, a strange pattern emerged. The tablets that spoke of trade or agriculture were displayed. Those that described sky beings, machines of light, or the crafting of mankind quietly disappeared. Some were marked as damaged or misplaced. Others were said to be part of private donations. A few were never mentioned again. In the late 1800s, a wave of discoveries across Iraq and Syria flooded European museums with artifacts. Yet within a few decades, the most controversial pieces were gone from the public record. Missionaries who had accompanied the expeditions wrote letters to Rome describing carvings of winged figures standing before strange devices, or inscriptions that spoke of the Annunaki descending to shape humanity from clay mixed with the blood of gods. The Church called these reports interesting but unverified. Soon after, the artifacts were transferred for preservation. They were never seen again. Even in modern times, the same pattern repeats. When a museum uncovers a tablet that challenges the accepted timeline or suggests advanced knowledge, the object is reclassified, loaned, or quietly returned to an unnamed institution. Curators whisper about missing crates, mislabeled shipments, or foreign collectors with special permission. Every piece that connects human origin to the stars seems to vanish the same way, into silence. The Vatican's role in this is rarely documented, yet its presence is constant. Many early excavation teams were financed or advised by church-linked scholars. Jesuit linguists often handled the first translations. Artifacts deemed theologically sensitive were recommended for private storage under the pretext of preservation. Once inside those archives, they joined a growing collection of pieces too dangerous to display. The official explanation is always safety, humidity, or lack of verification. But history shows that when knowledge threatens faith, disappearance becomes the safest response. Some scholars who tried to speak about these missing artifacts found their careers abruptly ended. Others published brief mentions in obscure journals that were later withdrawn. The pattern is too deliberate to ignore. Humanity's story is being edited not by fire, but by omission. Every artifact that vanishes leaves behind a gap where a revelation might have been. If these missing pieces were ever revealed, they might show that our ancestors did not simply imagine gods, they recorded encounters. The Church does not burn what it fears anymore, it stores it. And so the story of the Annunaki remains scattered, buried again not under sand, but beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. The trail ends not in a desert, but in locked rooms where truth is preserved so perfectly that no one may ever see it again. Today, the idea that ancient gods were visitors from the stars has become entertainment. It fills documentaries, talk shows, and online debates crowded with wild theories and exaggerated claims. The phrase ancient aliens has turned into a slogan, not a question. It invites laughter rather than investigation. Yet beneath the noise lies something more serious, something the Vatican and other powerful institutions quietly understand. When truth is wrapped in absurdity, no one dares to take it seriously. The concept becomes a joke, and the evidence, even if real, is dismissed without a glance. This is how control works in the modern world, not through censorship, but through ridicule. The ancient Sumerian tablets, the strange depictions of sky beings, the stories of gods descending in fire, all of it now lives in the same category as conspiracy theories. The public looks away, scholars protect their reputations, and the church remains silent. In that silence, it wins. Because for centuries, the Vatican has known that these myths mirror the earliest versions of biblical stories. They describe creation, floods, and divine messengers not as miracles, but as events. If the church were to admit even the possibility that the Anunnaki were real visitors, it would shake the foundation of divine exclusivity. So it lets the conversation continue in chaos, ensuring that anyone who approaches the topic is labelled eccentric. The more exaggerated the public discussion becomes, the safer the truth remains. Modern media plays its part perfectly. Ancient astronaut theories are presented alongside fantasy and pseudoscience. They are framed as curiosity, not research. This blurs the line between serious historical questions and pure fiction. The Vatican does not need to suppress the evidence when society has already learned to laugh at it. The irony is that the people shouting the loudest about aliens in ancient history may be unknowingly protecting the very powers they accuse. By turning the mystery into spectacle, they make it untouchable by legitimate scholars. Hidden within the noise could be fragments of truth, old inscriptions, genetic evidence, architectural patterns that connect humanity's origin to a much older story. But the moment anyone tries to explore it seriously, the laughter starts and the door closes. For the Church, that door must stay closed. It preserves its divine authority by allowing the ridiculous to guard the real. It knows that belief can survive doubt, but not proof. If the Annunaki were proven to have shaped humanity, then Genesis would become a historical record, not a divine revelation. The Vatican cannot risk that transformation. So the myth is allowed to live as myth, distorted, exaggerated, and endlessly mocked. In this way, the truth remains hidden in plain sight, protected not by secrecy, but by noise. The oldest trick of power is not to deny the truth, but to bury it beneath confusion, until no one can tell the difference between a question worth asking and a story made to be forgotten. If the Anunnaki truly shaped humanity, if they walked among the first people and left traces of their knowledge, skill, and perhaps even their DNA, then the entire foundation of Christian doctrine becomes fragile. Original sin, the idea that humanity inherited a moral flaw from a single act in Eden, suddenly raises questions. If humans were engineered by celestial beings, was disobedience truly a moral failure or simply a reaction to intervention? Salvation, too, becomes more complicated. If we are the product of a lineage touched by advanced creators, then the promise of redemption through Christ might not be the only path to understanding our origin or purpose. The incarnation itself, the moment God became man, takes on new dimensions. Was it an intervention on top of other interventions? Was it one layer in a long chain of contact, uplift, and guidance? The theological implications are explosive. Every doctrine built on the assumption of humanity as the creation of a singular, omnipotent deity would have to be re-examined. The Church could not casually admit the presence of earlier gods, because doing so would force believers to confront a world where divine authority is shared, contested, and perhaps even empirical. The very idea that someone else, someone older and more powerful than humans, had a hand in forming us, creating the framework of our intelligence and culture, challenges centuries of teaching. It suggests that the Bible, the texts of Revelation, may be just one chapter in a story that began long before the first prophets walked the earth. To preserve its spiritual authority, the Church must maintain the exclusivity of God's role in creation. Admitting prior intervention would be to admit that humanity has a history outside Scripture, a history where angels, or the Annunaki, taught, shaped, and perhaps guided the course of civilization. This is why the Vatican has spent centuries controlling manuscripts, translations, and access to texts. The goal is not merely to preserve knowledge, but to preserve interpretation. If anyone could prove that humans are descended from beings with their own plans, designs, and intelligence, then faith becomes complicated. It becomes a question of heritage, not obedience. Even the simplest moral teachings would be reframed, because the origin of sin, the meaning of death, and the path to redemption all depend on the narrative of human creation. An engineered humanity is a humanity with inherited knowledge, not inherited guilt. And a humanity with knowledge may not need salvation in the traditional sense. This is the theological bomb that the Church quietly diffuses through silence, secrecy, and selective preservation. The Annunaki, if real, represent a line of authority older than God's story as told in Christian doctrine. And any institution built on divine exclusivity cannot allow that line to be acknowledged. To do so would not only rewrite theology, it would rewrite our understanding of ourselves, our origins, and our place in the universe. The fingerprints of the Annunaki, whether in myths, DNA, or forgotten knowledge, threaten the central claim of the Church, that God alone shaped mankind. This is why their memory has been carefully managed, buried beneath centuries of doctrine, and filtered through layers of translation, canonization, and interpretation, until even the possibility of prior gods feels impossible to consider. The most powerful tool in any institution is not always force or punishment. Sometimes it is silence. The Vatican does not need to publicly deny the existence of the Annunaki or the possibility that humanity was touched by beings from the stars. It only needs to never fully confirm it. By remaining quiet, the Church allows believers to keep faith, confident in a history they were taught to trust. Science continues along its own paths, studying genetics, archaeology, and astronomy without questioning the foundations too deeply. Fringe researchers chase anomalies, publish controversial papers, and attract attention precisely because the mainstream ignores them. In that way, silence contains the conversation. The Anunnaki become a topic of speculation, not fact, and the line between evidence and fantasy blurs. Missionaries, scholars, and Jesuits, over centuries, have built a network not just of knowledge, but of controlled access to knowledge. Ancient tablets, translations, maps, and letters all pass through layers of supervision. Some information is released selectively, enough to satisfy curiosity, while the most sensitive pieces, texts hinting at advanced technology, celestial visitors, or the engineering of humanity, remain hidden, catalogued as private or heretical. The result is a perfect balance. Humanity learns just enough to remain obedient to faith. Researchers see anomalies, but cannot prove their meaning. Scholars who attempt to challenge the narrative are sidelined or dismissed. The Church need not argue or attack. It merely watches. Silence creates its own authority. Every unexplained artifact, every odd inscription, every tablet removed from circulation reinforces the sense that some things are too dangerous to handle. In centuries past, silence protected power through manuscripts. Today, it protects power through control of archives, restricted access, and the weight of institutional legitimacy. Anyone questioning the official story is measured against a wall of centuries of scholarship, doctrine, and legal control. The Annunaki are thus contained without confrontation. They exist in memory, but cannot emerge fully into history. By letting the topic float in public imagination, wrapped in myth, exaggeration, and sensationalism, the Church ensures that any potential disruption is drowned in noise. The public dismisses it as legend, television shows exaggerate it for ratings, and legitimate science avoids it for fear of ridicule. Those few who dig deeper encounter 1,000 small barriers, from restricted archives to uncooperative curators, from heavily edited translations to conflicting records. Silence, in this case, is more than strategy. It is architecture. It channels curiosity into harmless corridors and isolates the few who might approach the truth. And when the occasional fragment escapes into the open, it is quickly reframed, reclassified, or discredited. The result is a perfect containment system spanning centuries. Centuries in which the Church maintains control not by force of arms, but by shaping what can be spoken, studied, and believed. Belief itself becomes a cage. Through silence, the Vatican ensures that even the idea of advanced beings, the Annunaki, the watchers of Sumerian legend, never fully escapes the vaults, never fully challenges doctrine, and never interrupts the story of humanity that the Church has spent millennia carefully curating. Behind the quiet doors of libraries, seminaries, and hidden archives, there are whispers few ever hear. Theologians speak of manuscripts too sensitive for general eyes, texts so old and strange that their contents might disrupt centuries of teaching. Archivists who have spent decades organizing and preserving collections occasionally hint at documents that were never meant for publication, works that touch on the origins of humanity, the watchers of the sky, or the knowledge brought by beings the ancients once called gods. Translators, too, sometimes stumble across phrases that do not fit into the accepted narrative. A line describing a being descending from the stars, a tool used to measure the heavens, or humans moulded with care, becomes a question that must be asked carefully. To go further, to make the connection explicit between scripture and non-human intelligence, is to invite trouble. Careers have ended this way. Scholars who pushed too far were reassigned, publications blocked, or research grants quietly withdrawn. Some retired abruptly with little explanation, others vanished from the academic community entirely. The pattern is consistent. When a theory challenges the singular narrative of divine creation, it collides with centuries of authority. Those at the edge, those who study the overlap between scripture, mythology, and archaeology, must navigate a delicate path. Even a hint of suggestion that humanity might have been shaped by visitors from the stars risks being labelled heretical or eccentric. It is not overt censorship, it is subtle, a whispered caution, a footnote in a journal, a polite refusal to endorse a translation. The work continues quietly, in private, behind locked doors, far from the public eye. Some insiders describe texts with the margins filled with notes in Latin and Greek, phrases like materials too sensitive or not for public study. They speak of pages that describe advanced knowledge given to humans, instructions from beings the ancients revered, and observations that predate biblical accounts. Yet the archives maintain their silence. Those entrusted with this knowledge are bound by oaths and tradition. To reveal too much is to break a chain maintained over millennia. Even when fragments of these texts are referenced in academic discussions, they are heavily redacted. The truth is suggested, but never confirmed. It lingers at the edge, tantalizing, dangerous, and incomplete. Those who brush against it quickly learn the boundaries of the system. A careful career path can suddenly close. Invitations to conferences disappear. Articles are rejected. Positions at universities vanish. It is a lesson repeated across centuries. Knowledge that challenges the narrative is not destroyed, but it is contained. The whispers persist, however. Between archivist and scholar, translator and theologian, stories of anomalous findings, unusual inscriptions, and accounts of the Annunaki circulate quietly. They are passed along in conversation, hinted at in footnotes, and carefully documented in private journals. For anyone listening closely, it becomes clear that the silence itself is evidence. The Church does not need to refute the existence of sky beings. It only needs to ensure that those who might confirm it are kept on the margins, whispers fading into the quiet corridors of history. If the truth about humanity's origins ever comes to light, it will not be through chaos. It will arrive through control. The Vatican and the world's other great institutions understand that information can be more powerful than any army. They know that sudden revelation shatters belief, but gradual revelation reshapes it. If disclosure comes, it will not be announced as a shock, but introduced as a gentle correction. Angels will become extraterrestrial messengers. Divine intervention will become guided evolution, and the Annunaki will be redefined as misunderstood symbols of humanity's awakening. The story will not change completely. It will simply be rewritten to fit the world that already exists, polished until it feels familiar, comforting, and safe. That is how truth is contained. The Church has done this before. When astronomy proved that Earth revolved around the Sun, the Vatican eventually accepted it, not as defeat, but as a deeper understanding of creation. When geology revealed the age of the planet, faith adapted by calling it part of God's mysterious timeline. When Darwin's theory of evolution emerged, theologians reframed it as a divine mechanism. Every great discovery has been absorbed rather than opposed. The same pattern would apply to the Annunaki. The Church would not deny their existence if the evidence became undeniable. It would reinterpret it. The Annunaki would become instruments of divine will, ancient envoys of creation. Their actions would be folded into theology as part of God's plan. The hierarchy would remain intact, and the faithful would be reassured that nothing essential had changed. But in truth, everything would have changed. The danger is not that humanity learns its creators were once mistaken for gods, but that the revelation will be presented as another form of devotion. The Vatican has spent centuries mastering this art of containment. It knows how to unveil truth without surrendering control. When disclosure arrives, it will be staged. Documents will appear slowly, accompanied by official interpretations. Scholars will be guided to approved conclusions. Museums will curate exhibits that mix awe with reverence, ensuring no one questions the spiritual chain of command. In this way, the apocalypse of information becomes not destruction, but domestication. Humanity will be told it has new brothers among the stars, that faith and science were never enemies, that our origins are vast and mysterious but still under divine guidance. The old hierarchies will survive because they will claim to have foreseen it all along. The truth will not set humanity free. It will be managed, distributed, and interpreted until it serves the same powers that once hid it. And in that moment, when the world believes it has finally awakened, the oldest secret of all will remain intact. The Anunnaki will still be buried beneath language, symbol, and faith, transformed once again into myths that protect the structure rather than challenge it. The apocalypse will not come as fire. It will come as explanation, and it will leave the world exactly as it was, only more obedient. Across the ancient world, stories of beings descending from the sky appear again and again. In Sumer, the Anunnaki walked among humans, teaching, guiding, and shaping civilizations. In Egypt, gods with radiant crowns and wings delivered wisdom to pharaohs, showing mortals the secrets of astronomy, medicine, and architecture. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and other feathered serpents rose from the heavens, bringing knowledge of agriculture, calendars, and sacred geometry. In India, the Vedic texts describe devas who descended to teach humanity, wielding power over the elements and guiding kings. Across continents, across centuries, the pattern is unmistakable. A small group of celestial beings influencing the course of human civilization. Yet despite this overwhelming similarity, the Church has never led a public conversation connecting these myths. The Vatican, as the central authority on religion and ancient texts, studies the religions of the world closely. Missionaries have long catalogued indigenous beliefs. Jesuit scholars have translated Vedic hymns, and archivists preserve manuscripts from every corner of the globe. They see the pattern. They have to. And yet, the discussion never emerges. Why not? To admit that such similarities point to real historical contact with intelligent non-human beings would challenge fundamental doctrines of creation, divine exclusivity, and human uniqueness. It would force a re-evaluation of sacred history, lineage, and the role of the Church itself. Silence becomes the tool. The pattern exists, but it is never named. Each myth is treated separately, explained as allegory, superstition, or coincidence. Anthropologists and historians are allowed to speculate, but they rarely reach the deepest conclusion that humanity has been shaped, taught, and guided by forces outside our world. The Vatican benefits from this separation. By cataloguing knowledge without revealing its connections, it maintains both authority and mystery. The faithful continue to see God as the singular source of creation. Scholars remain curious, yet constrained. The legends of Quetzalcoatl, the Annunaki, and the Vedic devas are fragments, but never assembled into a coherent picture that could reveal the true scope of human history. Even when similarities are pointed out, the conversation is reframed. Beings from the sky become metaphors for morality, natural forces, or imaginative storytelling. The deeper implications are buried, and so the world continues unaware. The pattern is there for anyone willing to see it, but those in power ensure that public recognition never happens. The question becomes unavoidable. If these myths repeat across time and space, and if the Vatican has studied all of them, what does it mean that no one ever connects the dots publicly? The answer is not accidental. It is intentional. The Church maintains the narrative of singular creation, of divine authority, of faith as the central path for humanity. Recognizing that humanity may have been guided by sky beings across the globe would rewrite the story of civilization itself. Patterns exist. The Vatican cannot ignore them. And yet, it chooses to let them remain whispers, locked in manuscripts, hidden in archives, and left for those on the fringes to puzzle over. In that choice, power and secrecy endure, silently shaping the way humanity interprets its past, its present, and its place among the stars. The Anunnaki, if real, represent more than just gods of legend. They are a record of intervention, of knowledge handed down from beings outside of humanity, of engineering and guidance that shaped the earliest civilizations. To acknowledge them fully is to acknowledge that humanity has never been entirely independent, that kings, priests, and rulers were following scripts written by entities beyond the stars. This truth undermines the very foundation of spiritual authority. The Church presents itself as the mediator between God and man, the sole interpreter of divine will, and the keeper of salvation. If humans were touched by another intelligence before God's plan unfolded, the claim of exclusive authority becomes fragile. The Anunnaki could rewrite history not through violence, but by existence. Their legacy, embedded in myths, artifacts, and ancient knowledge, suggests a chain of power predating scripture itself. To admit it publicly would be to admit that faith is built atop a pre-existing framework, that divine authority is layered over human engineering, guidance, and perhaps manipulation. The safest course, from the perspective of those in power, was to erase the Anunnaki from collective memory, to fold their story into myth, to whisper their names in apocrypha, to keep the tablets, the letters, and the inscriptions locked in archives and private collections. By declaring them myth, the Church could maintain control over the narrative of creation, of kingship, and of salvation. The people would continue to believe in a world authored solely by God, unaware of the deeper lineages of influence. Missionaries, scholars, and Jesuits over centuries ensured that the knowledge of the Anunnaki never became public history. When tablets arrived from Mesopotamia, or letters described celestial visitors among indigenous tribes, the most dangerous passages were redacted, archived, or quietly disappeared. Those who questioned the process were sidelined or discredited. Over time, the story of the Anunnaki was reduced to speculation, fringe research, and entertainment, all while the truth remained quietly preserved for those deemed capable of understanding it without destabilizing faith. The irony is that the Anunnaki never truly vanished. They remain in symbols, in myths, in art, in the architecture of the ancients, and in the margins of hidden manuscripts. Yet by controlling the discussion, the Church ensured that their existence would never challenge authority. Even today, when texts and artifacts hint at advanced knowledge, unusual interventions, or guidance from the stars, they are presented as anomalies, coincidences, or allegory. The careful folding of the Anunnaki into myth protected the hierarchy and preserved the illusion of spiritual primacy. By keeping their memory locked, humanity's story could be told as a linear journey from creation to salvation, uninterrupted by evidence of other intelligences shaping our path. The Anunnaki became both too dangerous to reveal and too important to destroy. They exist as shadows, reminders that human history is more complex than the stories we are allowed to hear, and that some truths are carefully folded away, preserved only for the few who know where to look. Walk through St. Peter's Square and the Vatican itself, and look closely. Beyond the grandeur, beyond the marble, beyond the tourists and ceremonial pomp, there are signs that hint at something older, something almost forgotten. The papal regalia, with its triple crowns, the golden keys, and the sceptres, is more than ceremony. It carries echoes of ancient authority, a visual language that predates the Church, encoded in gold, gems, and symbols. Lions and eagles appear again and again, guarding doors, carved into reliefs, perched atop altars. To many, they are simple heraldry, symbols of power, vigilance, and courage. But in older cultures, they represented forces from the sky, beings who held dominion over human destiny. Obelisks rise from courtyards, reaching toward the heavens. Their origins trace back to Egypt, a civilization that worshipped gods who descended from the stars. When the Church brought these monuments to Rome, it did not erase their meaning. It repurposed it, folded it into the architecture of faith, making the symbols familiar while keeping their memory intact. Star crowns appear in frescoes and on ceremonial robes. They crown figures of saints, popes, and angels, yet their design resembles celestial patterns recorded thousands of years earlier. Constellations, sacred alignments, and celestial motifs are everywhere if you know how to look. Each detail is a signal, a whisper from the past, a reminder of the beings whose memory the Church inherited but could not fully acknowledge. Visitors walking through the Vatican may see only the spiritual narrative. The faithful see God, the hierarchy sees tradition, and most scholars see art. Few notice that the building itself is a museum of forgotten gods, symbols scattered across centuries, misinterpreted or renamed to fit doctrine. The keys, the crowns, the animals, and the monuments are not proof of prior visitors, yet they hint at continuity. They suggest that the Church understood something about humanity's past that it could not reveal. Even the layout of the Vatican is telling. Alignments of obelisks, domes, and altars echo older cosmologies. Walkways align with solstices. Altars point to distant stars. And rooms preserve arcane ratios in their construction. These are not random. They are echoes of a knowledge too old to speak aloud. Those who created, arranged, and maintained these symbols were aware of their origins. By rebranding them as Christian, the Vatican ensured their survival while controlling interpretation. The message is subtle, look closely, and the story of the Annunaki, the Watchers, and celestial benefactors whispers through gold, stone, and marble. The Vatican does not need to announce it. The clues exist for those willing to see, scattered across centuries, always present, always visible, yet understood by almost no one. The building, the art, and the ritual become a silent archive. It is a museum of misremembered gods, a collection of power, memory, and secrecy. And if you know where to look, the symbols will reveal a story that is older than faith itself. If the Vatican truly holds knowledge that humanity's origins stretch beyond the stories in the Bible, that we share our beginnings with beings who came from the sky, then silence becomes a question that cannot be ignored. Why would an institution charged with guiding souls and preserving truth withhold something so fundamental? The moral tension is immense. On one hand, the Church might argue that revelation of such knowledge could cause chaos, shake faith, and destabilize social order. People might question divine authority, reinterpret scripture, or feel betrayed by millennia of teachings. Fear, then, becomes the reason given for silence, a protection not just of the institution but of the faithful themselves. Yet the opposite view is equally compelling. Humanity has a right to its full story, to know the scope of its history, to understand the beings who shaped the earliest civilizations, and to see the patterns that stretch across continents and millennia. When information is withheld, knowledge is controlled, and curiosity is punished by omission. The line between protection and control blurs. The Vatican has spent centuries curating what can be read, who can translate, and which artifacts are accessible. Tablets from Mesopotamia, letters from missionaries, Jesuit reports on celestial phenomena. All have been filtered, archived, and often hidden. Those who stumble too close to conclusions connecting the Annunaki with scripture are silenced indirectly through academic pressures, redacted publications, and career obstacles. The moral question deepens. Is withholding knowledge truly for the good of humanity, or is it a way to maintain spiritual and cultural authority? By controlling the past, the Church controls the interpretation of the present and the future. Every myth reframed, every tablet sequestered, every symbol explained as allegory rather than memory reinforces a hierarchy of understanding. Faith survives, but understanding is constrained. Imagine if the truth were revealed, humans engineered, guided, or uplifted by beings whose story predates written history. The implications for theology, philosophy, and society are profound. Original sin, salvation, divine authority, and even the uniqueness of humanity would have to be reconsidered. The Vatican knows this, and so silence becomes the default. Protection and control coexist in the same act. The faithful remain faithful, the scholars cautious, and the public largely unaware. Yet even as centuries pass, fragments of the story leak through art, architecture, myths, and hidden archives. The evidence is scattered, subtle, and often misinterpreted. Those who seek it must learn to read the patterns in plain sight and question the stories they were taught to accept. The question remains, does humanity deserve to know, or is it too late to lift the veil? Silence preserves stability, but it comes at the cost of curiosity, freedom, and the right to the full human story. The Vatican, holding the keys to the earliest chapters of civilization, chooses silence as both shield and sword, leaving the moral question for each generation to wrestle with, as the truth waits patiently in the shadows. Beneath the bustling streets of Rome, beyond the marble floors and gilded ceilings, there lies a vault so deep, so heavily guarded, that its contents have been whispered about for centuries, yet never fully revealed. It is here, in the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, that the memory of civilizations, of kings, of sacred texts, and perhaps of the Annunaki themselves, rests. We may not know the full story of these beings, whether they walked among humans as gods, teachers, or engineers. What we do know is that someone does. Someone holds the keys to knowledge that stretches back thousands of years, to a time before written history, before empires rose and fell, before humanity fully understood its place in the cosmos. The vault itself is silent, yet it speaks. Every shelf, every carefully catalogued manuscript, every clay tablet hidden from public view is a testament to decisions made in shadow. Decisions about what humanity should see, what it can handle, and what must remain just out of reach. The Annunaki, if they existed, are only part of the story. Their presence raises questions that shake the foundations of faith, history, and identity. If humanity was shaped, guided, or influenced by beings from the stars, then everything we have been taught about creation, divine authority, and our origins must be reconsidered. That door beneath Rome locks more than just documents. It locks our certainty. It forces us to confront the possibility that history is incomplete, that religion is filtered, and that identity is shaped as much by omission as by revelation. Yet there is power in the unknown. The most dangerous secret is not that the Annunaki might have existed. The most dangerous secret is that someone decided you should never be sure. Belief can be manipulated, history rewritten, and knowledge concealed. But questions are harder to control. Every scholar who peeks at the margins, every theologian who wonders, every curious mind that refuses to accept the surface story keeps the question alive. And in that questioning lies freedom. The vault beneath Rome is vast, and its doors remain closed. We may never walk inside, and we may never see the texts, the symbols, or the artifacts that have been carefully preserved. But the shadow of what lies within stretches far beyond the stone walls, into libraries, museums, and the myths that have survived. We can sense it, study it, and imagine it. To confront the unknown is not to deny faith or history. It is to embrace the fullness of curiosity, to acknowledge that knowledge is never complete, and that truth may be layered, obscured, and curated. And so we return to the question that began this journey. Who were the Annunaki? And why does a central authority hold their memory so tightly? Perhaps we will never know completely. Perhaps that door will remain closed for centuries more. But the act of asking, of keeping the possibility alive, is itself an act of reclamation. The last locked door is a reminder that the human story is unfinished, that curiosity is essential, and that the search for truth is never truly complete. We must not bow to certainty. We must keep asking, keep seeking, and keep the question alive.